Next, we'll hear from Annie Lewson. Annie conducts research for the Conservation Research Center of Teton Science Schools in Jackson, Wyoming. She contributed intensively to an aspen assessment and inventory project with Wyoming Game and Fish and the Forest Service in the Grays River Ranger District. And she's been working on research and restoration projects since 2003, including native plant restoration with Red Butte Gardens in Salt Lake City, wolf habitat use in southwest Alberta, and small mammal research in western Siberia.
So I've been working the last 2 years as part of a field-based project with Steve Kilpatrick of Game and Fish and Don DeLong of Forest Service with Afton. So we're getting more of a ground-up perspective with this talk here. We'll go over, or I will go over, the aspen distribution in the West and condition on the landscape today, a need for study across the landscape, project objectives, and our methods are really a template for use. So I'd like to preface the talk with the statement that this might seem to be very project-specific, but it was designed with the intent of use throughout other landscapes, particularly in the Bridger-Teton National Forest. Aspen distribution is fairly widespread. It's actually the most widely distributed tree species in North America, extending from the Pacific to the Atlantic and all the way north into Alberta. We're looking at aspen distribution in the interior west here. The red line that I drew very crudely is the border of Sierra Nevada to the west and the Wasatch to the east. We can see that most of the distribution lies within the Wasatch Front in Utah and Colorado. It seems my animations aren't really working, but I'll go with that. So a little bit of aspen background. They reproduce primarily by vegetative reproduction. You have an individual that spreads laterally through roots, and the auxin-cytokine imbalance requires some sort of disturbance to produce this suckering. Seeding events are not as rare as previously thought, as seen in fire episodes in southeast Arizona and Yellowstone. They require a certain specific requirement, particularly in soil and temperature, for them to succeed, but they produce primarily through asexual suckering. Aspen are disturbance dependent, so they're shade intolerant. As conifers move into the canopy cover, their success decreases in terms of productivity. They're also disturbance dependent in disturbing the auxin-cytokine imbalance. So although they do reproduce without that imbalance, as we see with clear cutting, there's much lower density in suckering as a result of fire treatments, for example. Why are aspen important? We always talk about aspen decline on the landscape, but they're valued for many reasons and to many different people. They're generally areas of high bioproductivity and biomass. They have comparatively higher water yield as opposed to conifer communities coming in. So in areas such as the Great Basin, where there's already a low precipitation value, that change in community type over time will be significant. Aspen communities provide critical habitat for both large game and small critters alike. So for a state like Wyoming, where a lot of income is generated through hunting, both in-state and out-of-state, we see this as really a critical economic value. And lastly, it's an aesthetic value. People like going to aspen stands. People prefer to develop in areas with aspen. And we see here, this is an example of a stand with a high conifer component and a lot of standing dead aspen. Throughout the West, there are various risks to aspen distribution and health, and these are not necessarily specific to the Great Basin, but included in them. There's generally been a lack of disturbance events over the last 100 years, and that's mainly fire exclusion policies. And as a result, there's increasing dominance of cereal aspen on the landscape. There's been historic overgrazing, so the aspen that are sending up suckers are have historically been browsed to the zone of mechanical protection, so unlikely to grow through any sort of browse levels. The 20th century was also a warm century, as we've been hearing the last couple of talks. The Great Basin has experienced an average temperature increase of 0.6 to 1.1 degrees over the last century. There's an anticipated further increase over the next century. What the extent of that is unknown, but in the Great Basin itself, there's been a noted decline in snowpack levels. There's been an average increase in precip over the summer and earlier spring. So for a community like aspen communities that rely on an early initial start to get going before other communities, the results could be critical. And the risk of disease. So there's been a lot of discussion of sudden aspen death, which is a very vague term for a sudden death of aspen. So in the background we see some stands with no foliage, and they are experiencing sudden aspen death, which is death of a mature stem and then spread radically throughout the stand. The extent of it is just still being documented, obviously. Most of it is focused primarily in western Colorado, but it has been documented north into Alberta and south into New Mexico. Because of all these risks, there is a need for study and management of this species because it is highly regarded. With new risks such as sudden aspen death, and we can see from posters set up out in the lobby there that there are very different ways to make large-scale assessments, and we need to discover as many ways as possible to do so. But we need to document, first of all, the baseline data, and second of all, monitor after the establishment of this data. While there is a general decline noted across the West and in the Great Basin, there are documented cases of aspen increase on the landscape, so we need to monitor for both reasons. In particular, areas in the Great Basin, they're experiencing high population growth rates, so this has seen increased usership on public lands and private lands as well. And managers need to make sound scientific management decisions to inform these plans. I believe that Utah is number 4 in growth rate for the U.S. and Nevada is number 1. So we need large-scale assessments for these reasons. The project area that I've been working in is outside of the Great Basin in western Wyoming. It's part of the Bridger-Teton National Forest, which is one of the largest national forests in the lower 48. And you can see it's on the western side of the district. It's a 500,000 acre ranger district. It's primarily dominated by mid to low elevation subalpine forests that are mature to decadent, as are the aspen stands that are seen on the landscape now. So we want to create a management plan. We need to create this management plan, but also look at what sort of past historic pressures have been on the landscape. And I'm just going to go over a little overview here of land use history since the 1850s, when it really started becoming increasingly settled. There was major fire episode during the late 1800s, so most of the aspen on the landscape now are a result of that fire. Prior to that, there were mixed severity fires every 40 to 70 years. A good balance of early to middle cereal aspen. Not much human use, but we see a surprisingly large number of livestock on the forest. And they were primarily brought up through thoroughfares from this valley and southern valleys. And we can see there's many different quotes showing that the resulting management plan was not so good. There was no management plan. Starting in the early 1900s, there was a very aggressive fire exclusion policy, having wildfires out by 10 a.m. the next day. Over time, there was a decreasing amount of cereal and early aspen, so they're getting older. There's Star Valley influx, so population pressures are increasing. And the forest came under the allotment system in 1905, so numbers of livestock became much more regulated. More current day management plans involve wildfire management and prescribed burns in priority areas. As the previous slide showed, there's a high dominance of cereal aspen, and there's increasing pressures, especially in Star Valley, with people coming down from Jackson to find more affordable living and developing very close to forest boundaries, and much more regulated livestock numbers. So this map gives a visual indication of historic fire locations. These are all since 1900. Pink is prescribed burn, so very few acres of prescribed burn. But in general, you can see that there's a large lack of disturbance events and fire on the landscape in here. Timber harvest has been on the decline since 1963. There have been about 10,000 acres harvested. So in general, a pretty universal lack of disturbance events. This brings us into the project itself. So I was on the ground for 2 years doing the actual data collection. And the main objective was to inventory and assess their distribution across this Grays River Ranger District. Ultimately, it is to provide a roadmap, a geodatabase roadmap for managers to make scientific-based decisions. So again, just to reiterate, a high amount of cereal aspen on the landscape. This is based on a landscape scale assessment conducted in 2004. And the desired condition is to both increase distribution and the spread of successional states within the stands themselves. We've been talking a lot about making informed management decisions and making decisions that are scientifically based. Previously on the Bridger-Teton, which is a 4 million acre area, there was no management plan. Managers would drive out to a spot, look at a bad area, and decide to burn that area or treat it in any other mechanical way. So this is a systematic way, hopefully more scientifically based than previously. And because this is a collaborative project with the Forest Service and Game and Fish, it's a high priority area for managers such as Steve Kilpatrick. And why this certain area was chosen in particular was merely a result of functional relationships. So would a decision actually be able to be made with this group? Most likely, yes. And in this particular area, there's been a noted aspen decline on the neighboring national forest. And you can see decrease in cover since the early 1900s. So all signs point to we need some sort of management plan and assessment in the area. A secondary objective, which was kind of a nice byproduct of the partnership, was ground truthing and mid-level existing veg layer that was remotely sensed. There's an active partnership between RSAC, Intermountain Regional Office, and Liz Davey from the BTNF. So lots of different data layers were input to this image cube. I don't really know very much about remote sensing. This is how it was generally created. And in 2006, there were field samples conducted to go back and inform the decision tree. They found, based on the field data, that there was 63% accuracy, which was the lowest end of map unit accuracies. So they wanted more data to put back into their field samples to further inform their decision tree. Methods are two-parted. One is the actual mapping of the stands, and two is conducting live dead transects, which allow for a quick assessment of browse trends over a large area. Again, this is a template for use to be enacted not only within the Bridger Teton, but throughout the West. So these are the 2006 NAPE aerial imagery field maps that we used overlaid with the veg layer polygons. So each little green blob up there is calculated by to be an aspen community type. So techs went out into the field with this sort of map, and this is the resulting polygons that they would draw. They had minimum map units of 5 acres. So it's very low tech in terms of the actual field collection, but makes it much more affordable when you can fund a project for cheap. Within each patch, we have classifications to monitor vegetative components, percent standing dead, and regeneration rates. So we classify dominant over and understory species. We give ocular estimates of canopy cover. Community types were based on Mueggler. I know that there have been community types in the Sierra Nevadas that are more functional, that take more into account soil content, elevation, slope. But for managers, the community type from Mueggler are directly linked to fire groups. So for our area, it's the most accurate. We also classify map unit. This is a Forest Service classification that we modified for Mixed-Aspen to take into account understory conifer component, as we see is an increasing problem on the landscape. And aspen are defined as less than 60% combined conifer cover and greater than 60% aspen in the canopy. So just remember MAS, ASP, Mixed-Aspen, aspen. And the last assessment, which is really the most important assessment, was taken from Campbell and Bartos, and it establishes certain risks in a very quantifiable way. So when a manager needs to make a decision, they can go back to this geodatabase and assess. So highest priority, they're going to have at least half the canopy cover. And they go down high priority, sagebrush presence, moderate to high priority with at least 25% conifer component, less than 500 stems per acre, so is it regenerating? And then any combination of these risks down to a candidate for properly functioning condition. And I'll refer back to these later in the presentation. The second main part to the methods was conducting live dead transects. They're quick assessments to be able to measure browse, quantify browse over a period, or over a space. So transects are conducted in a diversity of areas to sample maximum aspect, slope, elevation, and community type. And 20 samples are measured in each transect. Within each transect, 3 simple measurements are taken. You measure to the height of base of current year growth, measure to the height of dead, so you must have a complete dead annual increment, and then height of live, which is your leader length. So, sorry, I said that wrong. Leader length is from your apical bud all the way down to your base of current year growth. And your LD index is, again, simple math, it's subtraction. So for managers to be able to go back and analyze the data, it's a pretty simple event. What do these numbers mean? An LD index, so you have your height of base of current year growth minus the height of dead. With an LD index around 0, you're getting browse to this zone of mechanical protection. And this annual increment is likely to grow out of the browse zone. But really, we can't really say too much about this, unfortunately. It's one of the limitations. Height of dead here, this is your zone of mechanical protection. And we have your base of current year growth at the very bottom here. This plant is unlikely to grow out of the browse zone. And I refer to the browse zone as a defined area that ungulates are likely to browse in. For our purposes, it was between 50 and 180 centimeters in height. With an LD index significantly greater than 0, you're going to see a plant likely growing out of the browse zone. So again, you're able to assess browsing patterns over a shorter period of time historically and anticipate their growth trends in the future. Leader length, I mentioned leader length earlier in the previous slide. A leader length is really to establish your threshold value on a site-to-site basis. So we established a leader length of 50, which was a result of communicating with Dr. Keegley, who designed the protocol itself. We conducted 91 transects over the district. Each one is represented with a dot. And again, I mentioned the browse zone. So they're pretty widely distributed. There is definitely sampling error in the transects because they are not randomly generated. Transects were selected by technicians, and that's something that could be improved upon for future use. So real briefly, again, transects allow managers to make a quick assessment to monitor for objectives met. If you go into an area and you want to treat it for fire, you have high browsing pressure, you need to address ungulate management in addition to getting regeneration on the landscape. The LD values allow you to interpret recent browsing history and track short-term trends. The most important aspect about this transect is to indicate red flag areas. So we'll get into analysis. We found primarily occupied by highest priority areas, so they had at least 50% conifer cover. One of the more interesting aspects of this study was comparing the existing veg layer distribution and content to our data collected on the ground. We found almost twice as much on the ground data, on the ground aspen map units as they calculated in the remote sensing layer. And there's also extremely large distribution of Mixed-Aspen here as opposed to here, and that's largely due to the fact the remote sensing layer did not pick up conifer because it classified anything with greater than 60% of one dominant species type as that. So if you had a stand of 60% pseudotsuga and 40% aspen, it would not classify that. Okay. Takeaway message here. These are browse trends based on the LD transects. So we see here on the x-axis we have an escape browse pressure. These are the number of individuals with an LD value less than 50. So they're being prevented from growing through the browse zone. If I was a manager, I could come in here and see these areas need attention. And we correlate them with LD values on the y-axis, and we see that they're also doing poorly. So we need to set objectives prior to management. For our objectives, we wanted at least a fourth to a third to exceed the threshold. So future use of this project is really large scale. It provides a basis for regular monitoring. It allows you to indicate red flag areas, and it's also a cost-efficient way to assess aspen over a large landscape scale. Lastly, most importantly, this is a product of multiple agencies working together, not only to design protocols to ensure good methods and data that each agency wants, but a good scientific way to do so. I'd like to thank other partners and questions.
For a question or two?
Yeah.
Excuse me. About how long do you think it would take to do a 500,000 acre just to get the base map?
To get the base map, it took 2 technicians 2 field seasons. So very low tech of walking around, getting good elevation gain. So
A big crew, 2 years.
Two techs, 2 years. Yeah.
Were any of your sites in aspen stands that did not see livestock?
All of the stands had seen grazing within the last 50 years. They may not have active allotments on them right now, but they all had livestock pressure from within the last 50 years. There are 2 feed grounds in the district, so they need to also be taken into account as well.
Can you comment about the role of non-ungulate browsing, rabbits, etc., small mammals?
We didn't assess for that. In terms of large-scale management, to my knowledge, it's not as much of a browse pressure issue, so we didn't assess for that.
Could you just explain what you mean by feed grounds? People who are not from western Wyoming might not realize what those are.
So feed grounds were established, I believe, in the early 1900s as a way to get wild ungulates that had certain diseases away from their livestock. So in western Wyoming, they've established feed grounds. They feed them daily. They feed elk primarily to draw them away from their own livestock. So at this point, they spend a lot of money continuing this, and they've actually altered migration routes and ungulate patterns over the landscape. So they've debated stopping funding of feed grounds, but at this point they've really changed a lot of the ungulate behaviors over time.
Just wondering what the effect of aspen in those areas is.
There's significantly higher browsing around feed grounds, and fire would not be recommended in those areas because of such a high pressure.